One of the main topics when it comes to the idea of cells is that of cellular transport. As it states, cellular transport is the movement of molecules into and out of cells through the cell membrane. Sometimes the word itself, cellular transport, gets confusing for students because they believe cellular transport to mean the transport of cells, when in fact it's the transport of materials through a cell membrane into and out of those cells. In order for that to be accomplished, that has to occur through what is pictured here, which is a cross-section of a cell membrane. You can see there's a lot of parts to it, and all those parts together form what would be a barrier. The cell membrane is in fact a barrier between inside and outside of the cell. It keeps some things in the cell, and it keeps other things out of the cell. And yet, a cell requires materials, and it needs to export materials as well. So the cell membrane cannot simply be a barrier. It must be what's referred to as a selectively permeable barrier. It has to allow certain items in and others out, and that, as we said, is cellular transport. Largely, that cell membrane is made of structures referred to as phospholipids, as pictured here. A phospholipid is a bit odd in that it is what is called amphipathic. What that means is that it has a portion of itself that has charge and a portion which lacks a charge. If you look at the phospholipid structure, you can see the top of which is made up of what is referred to as the phospholipid head, the bottom portion by what are called the two tails, which are just fatty acids. If we look up here on the head, you can see a negative sign. In other words, there's a charge. And because there's a charge, there is attraction of water to it. Remember that water has both a positive and negative pole, and so the positive end of a water molecule would be attracted to the negative end of this head of the phospholipid. That makes this portion hydrophilic, or water-loving. Conversely, down here at the bottom on these saturated and unsaturated fatty acid tails, there is no charge. There is instead neutrality, which makes the tails not attracted to water, nor water to it, and thus they are referred to as hydrophobic, or water-fearing. Those many phospholipids then align themselves in this sort of strange way, in which the heads form the outside and far inside of the cell membrane, and the tails, the hydrophobic tails, make up the middle portion of the cell membrane. This is referred to as a phospholipid bilayer. So hydrophilic portions on the extreme sides and hydrophobic tails making up the middle of the cell membrane. In order to understand how cell transport works, you have to understand the idea of a solution, because on the inside, really, we are just one giant solution. A solution is made up of a solute and a solvent. The solute is anything that is being dissolved, and the solvent is anything doing the dissolving. So if you look at the picture here, salt is being put into water. That salt will dissolve in the water, meaning that the salt is the solute of the solution, and the water is the solvent. We have lots of water inside of us, making water the solvent of our body in most cases, and we have many things dissolved in the water of our bodies, many different solutes. There are many different types of cell transport, and we can describe or define those different types based on three main categories or characteristics. Those three provide us with choices. Concentration gradient, where the choice is either up or down. Energy necessities, where the choice is either active or passive. And carrier molecules, where the choice is either mediated or non-mediated. And we'll go through each of those three choices and allow those three choices to define the different types of cell transport. Our first choice was between up or down the concentration gradient. If you notice the picture, we have here what is supposed to represent a cell membrane. That's what these dashed lines are. On the left side, we have these green dots, which should represent solute particles, and I guess the light pale blue behind them, that should represent the water that is the solvent of this solution. What you should notice is that there are far more solute particles, a greater concentration of solute particles on the left than there is on the right. If solute particles from where it's more highly concentrated move towards where it is less concentrated, we would say that that is moving down the concentration gradient. If, on the other hand, solute particles from, in this case, the right side, where they are less concentrated, moves towards the area that is already greater in concentration, then we would refer to that as moving up the concentration gradient. Some types of cell transport move solute particles up, others move down. Another choice that we have is the choice between active or passive. Active simply means that energy is required. In other words, your body must expend its own energy in order to move something across the cell membrane. The picture here is of a molecule called ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. That is the molecule that supplies our bodies with energy, which is why it is pictured here. If you have to use some of that ATP, in other words, if you have to use some of the energy in your body to move things across the cell membrane, we would describe that as an active process. If, on the other hand, the particles, the solute particles themselves, have enough energy on their own to move across the cell membrane, and you don't have to add any extra, then that form of cell transport would be described as passive. Lastly, we have the choice of mediated and non-mediated. If you look at the picture here, you see here what is largely the phospholipid bilayer, and what you see here stuck in the midst of that phospholipid bilayer is a protein, and that protein can act as what is called a carrier molecule. If a particle on one side of this cell membrane requires the help of a carrier molecule, one of these proteins, in order to move through the cell membrane and get into or out of the cell, then we would describe that process as being mediated. Mediate means to help, and this solute particle in blue required the help of this protein acting as a carrier molecule in order to move across the cell membrane. If, on the other hand, for instance, like these red particles right here, if they can on their own, without any help, move through this phospholipid bilayer and come out the other side, then that is a non-mediated process. So we're going to use those three choices, up or down, active or passive, and mediated or non-mediated, to help describe the different types of cell transport which allow particles to move through the selectively permeable cell membrane.